I attribute this to Bill McKibben, but I think a lot of folks have said this. But I remember him saying this years ago when I was in a room, younger, greener environmental reporter, hearing someone else ask Bill McKibben this question, and he was like, "Join something bigger than yourself." And I really love that. And so, whatever that bigger something is, be a part of a movement. But like the Japanese concept of ikigai has, like, I feel like I've heard this in a few spaces. Like, if you think about the Venn diagram of like what you're good at, what the world needs, and what brings you joy, like whatever is in that middle of those three things, do it. And I think that like this concept of ikigai applied to climate change work and climate change action could be really effective.
This episode is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Tidal Influence, a Californian ecological consulting firm who proudly supports environmental education and all of the diverse conservation efforts that Pelicanus works to highlight. Visit their website at tidalinfluence.com to learn more about what they do to conserve our coastal resources and how you can get involved. On today's Conservation Conversations episode, we talk with Rosanna Xia. Rosanna is an author, documentary filmmaker, and environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times, where she specializes in stories about the coast and ocean. Her new book, called California Against the Sea, is out now wherever you purchase books, but we always like to recommend your local independent bookstore. So let's get straight to our conversation with Rosanna about the future of California's coast. Rosanna, thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you on the show. We are here to talk about your work and this book in particular, California Against the Sea. Let me put it where you can see it. And yeah, please, can you just introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks, Austin. It's an honor to be on this show. Really nice to meet you, and I'm just so grateful for the work that you and Taylor do. Um, yeah, so I'm Rosanna, author of the book California Against the Sea, and I guess by way of intro, my day job is I'm an environmental reporter for the Los Angeles Times with a focus specifically on stories about our coast and ocean. And so I'm in charge of thinking about how every community and every ecosystem up and down the coast fits into this bigger, more collective story about one of the most iconic shorelines in the world. And I mean, and this, the California coast is massive, more than 1,200 miles long just along the outer coast alone, and then hundreds of more miles along the inner San Francisco Bay estuary. And just, dozens of cities and counties. And there are also so many communities within communities and neighborhoods within neighborhoods to get to know, and so many different perspectives to take into consideration. So that's kind of like the universe that I cover on a day-to-day basis for my day job, which also kind of evolved into the book that we're about to talk about. Um, and yeah, and I also cover, I'm in charge of the entire Pacific Ocean. So if there's ever a story out on like marine protected areas and, marine science and deep ocean um, issues, like those are also kind of in my purview.
That's insane. Let me just say that first. So I guess, before we get into the book, I kind of want to hear about like, what are some of the stories that and you said it's not even just Los Angeles or Southern California, it's the entire California coastline and the Pacific Ocean. So like, what are some of the stories, and is this like kind of like deep investigative journalism, or is it kind of more like here's a couple things that have popped up, let's go just a shallow dive, or do we go deep dive? Is it like, do you work on stories for years and then like here's this great thing that came out after like 6 years of investigative journalism, like or is it a mix of everything?
All of the above. I mean, I think, I'm always ready for breaking news. So if an oil spill happens, I'm usually the first person to get called in the newsroom to think about, because the way a large newsroom like the LA Times would think about a story is like, there's day one story, but there's also, as like kind of a more projects enterprise specialty focused reporter, I'm thinking about what the day 30 story is, or what, the story is after the disaster has happened, after, the news cycle has moved on. What does that look like a year from now for the community, 5 years from now? And so I think, that's kind of how I think about breaking news. And then with enterprise, I'm always constantly thinking about the stories that we don't know we need to care about, right? So some of my stories are reactive to the news, and others are kind of making the news and setting the agenda or helping people think more deeply about an issue or connecting the dots. That's something that I find really powerful with my beat specifically. With this book, for example, and with just the way I was writing about sea level rise 10 years ago, we weren't necessarily connecting the dots that this community up here in California was dealing with the same set of issues that a community in the San Diego area was dealing with, or that, all these different pockets of wetland conservation efforts had this broader story to be told if you actually looked at all of the pieces together. And so I think of my beat a lot, and we call them beats in journalism. Um, I think a lot of my work is dot connecting and big picture making and helping people find commonality in what they're saying and what they're seeing. I think within kind of the worlds of science and even in environmental planning, you know, a lot of folks in this specific research, like field of research, isn't necessarily talking to the geologists or the ecologists. And I think that, or the engineers, a lot of engineers and scientists and research people don't necessarily trade notes all the time. So I find myself a lot in these spaces where I'm like, hey, did you know that this person's working on this thing and this thing? And you guys are actually saying kind of the same thing. And similarly with like, I think the qualitative and the quantitative. I'm often in communities. I'm speaking to people who are experiencing things firsthand that aren't necessarily like hard data points yet, but they also fit into kind of a data story that's coming together for someone who's sitting, in their lab doing the meticulous work of trying to piece together what's actually happening out in the world.
I love the point where you said the commonality between different communities, because as you well know, it's very easy to get pulled into either side, and so there's only two sides, and you have to be on either one. And when it comes to things like this, there is no sides. We're all going to be affected by, if you live on the coast, especially, but even if you don't, the climate change is real, and a lot of what I do on my day to day basis, especially when I do like some of the firework or even some other work, where it's a lot of like, there's this group, there's like five different groups, and they all have different goals, but there is a common ground, and we're like, let's figure out how we can work together to where we all can do what we need to do. And obviously, that's a very specific thing, but when you're talking about these large scale concepts, something like an MPA or sea level rise, it's like it's refreshing to see that. I don't know if refreshing is the right word, but it's encouraging, I guess, to see that, because, like I said, when you click the news things, it's all like one side versus the other. So I love to hear that.
Yeah, and not to just get super geeky super fast with you, but I feel like this is the space to say this. I think, something I reflect a lot on with people in the conservation space is, years ago, I feel like the approach was let's save one endangered species at a time, or let's save one parcel at a time. And, the equivalent for me is writing one story at a time about one very specific issue. And I do think, and correct me if I'm wrong, in the conservation space in the last few years, especially thinking about climate adaptation and conservation as the role of conservation in climate adaptation as we move forward, thinking about what it means to restore or conserve on the landscape scale and not just thinking about, parcel by parcel, species by species, plant by plant. And all of it is important, but kind of recognizing the bigger picture and recognizing that, yes, efforts to save this very specific um, ecosystem or very specific species will help ultimately serve the greater picture, but kind of recognizing that rather than everyone doing their own work and fighting their own battles and trying to save their own thing in all these different places, like what's the bigger picture here? And I think as as a storyteller, I find so many commonalities in the narratives of all these people doing such important work on the ground, but recognizing that we all belong to a greater ecosystem, a greater landscape, and how do we think about the landscape collectively is something that I'm also recognizing is happening in the conservation world in a very empowering and inspiring way.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I've observed over the last 20 years or so. Is conservation has been a lot of silos where everyone's kind of doing their own thing, and then now we're the last maybe 5, 10 years, maybe even longer. But I mean, I'm just becoming aware of it. But people are starting to like, let's figure out how to do this together, because when we're not connected here, It's just not nothing's going to get done. So I love to hear that. But let's talk about, let's see, get it here, Vanna White here. California Against the Sea: Visions for Our Vanishing Coastline. I still said it wrong, but um, so what is it? What was it that made you go, there's a book here. I got to write this. There's something. I've heard all these different stories. They come together into one theme. Like, what was it that made you have that realization that you had to write this book?
Yeah. So I'm the coastal and ocean reporter on the LA Times environment team. And I should start by saying that I feel so lucky to be an environmental reporter in this day and age, that gets to only focus on coastal and ocean issues. And at the LA Times, our environment reporters are all each assigned like a specialized focus. We have a water reporter, we have a wildfire reporter, we have an air quality reporter, and like an extreme weather reporter. So, when I just have the space to think about just the coast and ocean, that allows me to really go deep on more specific topics. And so, with my focus, the one big recurring issue that came up in every community that I went to was the question of sea level rise. Recognizing that the ocean is moving inland, and the what do we do about it question was haunting and looming over every single place that I went to. And, for years, I was kind of writing what would be considered the more old school approach to newspaper reporting, the reactive approach that we were just talking about. A new study comes out that finds that 2/3 of our beaches in California could disappear by 2100. That was a big USGS study that, really shook the space. Almost a decade ago at this point. There was also this really sobering study in 2016 led by the USGS that found that West Coast salt marshes as an entire ecosystem was projected to go extinct by 2100 due to coastal squeeze and all of the forces, that are happening right now along our shoreline. If we continued business as usual, this was the reality. And so with each of these big studies, I would write that story as a breaking news story. A new study found that blah, 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 blah. And all those stories would make a huge splash. I think all those stories made the front page of the LA Times. It would often be one of the most read articles on the LA Times website for that day. But then, a day later, a week later, people moved on. And in the same way, sadly, a disaster wipes out a community, and then the sun comes out, another disaster happens somewhere else, and people move on, and the next news cycle happens. I think there was this disconnect that was really making me feel unsettled, or at least I was just trying to really think existentially, like, how do we, I am seeing the dots. I am seeing the continued building momentum of this looming crisis that everyone's thinking about, but everyone wasn't thinking about all the time. Only when we would grab their attention with a big news of the day kind of moment. And so a few years ago, I really started thinking about, what the deeper messages were here. How do I help people stay with this issue? And out of that did come this book idea. And, I never set out to write a book per se. I would say that a lot of folks were starting to connect with the way I was writing about sea level rise as a drumbeat reporter on this, in this space. And I ended up connecting with an amazing editor, Martina Satras at Heyday Books. And, Heyday is this wonderful indie publisher based in Berkeley that has, just a track record of really publishing books that broaden and deepen the way we think about nature and history in California and they have a particular eye for recentering indigenous perspectives in these conversations. And there was a spark with Martina, and she kind of convinced me in the course of early conversations that there was a book that needed to be written. And, she was the one who helped me figure out how to tell this bigger story about sea level rise and our relationship to the ocean through specifically the lens of California and also the story and the history of California. And so, yeah, and Martina ended up helping me just create the book that I wish had existed when I first started covering the coast.
I think one of the challenges of talking about something like climate change, sea level rise, these large global scale, millennial scale changes is our lives are so short and we're all just trying to get through the day. Some people just want to get to the end of the day so they can turn on Netflix and just turn off. And so how do you approach, I guess, taking something like climate change and sea level rise and making it something urgent that we can think about now?
Ooh, that's a big question, and I think I would be curious to hear what uh, other folks say as you talk to them for this amazing series. I do hear the term slow moving disaster come up a lot in the sea level rise coastal adaptation space. Even like in California, even in the climate change space, like wildfires, drought, like there are a lot of other climate change issues that tend to dominate the climate change conversations, and sea level rise just feels less urgent and less pressing. And you know, like, yeah, you can't stand on a beach for one afternoon and really feel the urgency of sea level rise. But that urgency is there. And I think the thing with sea level rise that, some of the things that I have found effective in the way scientists and planners and folks kind of in this space, that have been effective is just kind of communicating the frequency of things, pointing out that like, hey, it used to be a 100-year storm every couple of years. Now it's 3 times a year. Or like this road that you rely on to get to work, to get to school, to go to the hospital if your loved one needs to go to the emergency room. That road used to never flood. And then we all got shocked when it got flooded, in the early 2000s. And now it's flooding every high tide. And, tracking this, logging this, showing the increased frequency of a flood event or like in a vulnerable space has been effective in shifting the conversation and recognizing that we shouldn't wait until it's completely underwater to do something about it. There's an incredible research team at Scripps Institution of Oceanography down at UC San Diego, where they presented to me once the way they said it once was like, do you need to wait for that scary blue line on a flood map to go all the way inland? Do you need to wait for a home or a road or a critical piece of infrastructure to be completely underwater for it to be a problem? Or if something is flooding 25% of the year or every winter, like at what point is that essentially underwater for our planning purposes? And do we need to respond to that? So I think that has been a really helpful way of communicating the need to do something about this issue now versus later. And I think the other thing that I've found effective is just this idea of compounding disasters. I don't know if this has come up in any of your other conversations, but in the spirit of talking about silos, for a long time, like I would see people, the wildfire people doing the modeling over here, and the sea level rise flooding people doing the modeling over here, and the river flooding people, and the extreme precipitation people. Ooh, I can't say that word. The Pineapple Express, atmospheric river people doing their modeling over here. And they're like, if this really crazy event happens, this is what happens. But no one was necessarily accounting for what happens if an atmospheric river and a high tide happen at the same time. What happens if the rivers have just absorbed 10 days of back to back to back rainstorms and they're swollen. There's no more additional water that they can hold, and the groundwater is completely saturated. The soil is completely saturated with groundwater. And now we have a winter swell and a high tide, a king tide coming in. Where does the water go? And I think, add that to fires. Flash flooding is more common after, an entire landscape has been denuded of the vegetation. And so what happens when all of these extreme events happen together? Then you don't have to wait until 2050 for something scary to happen. All of that is starting to compound, and it create, pretty tragic like disasters that can happen now. And the 2030s are like, people are now looking at the 2030s timescale, whereas like 10 years ago, I would say a lot of the studies and projections I was writing about was like, this will happen in 2100, this really scary thing. And 2100 feels so far off to still so many people. And as we move that timescale closer to 2050 and now the 2030s, I think that conversation has shifted in the sea level rise world.
I guess where I would like to go next with this is, as I said, like I mentioned, the Palisades fire, and like when you kind of come to uh, climate change and sea level rise, a lot of people are considering like, oh, Malibu, the homes. What about, where are they going to rebuild the homes on the coast there? And actually, that kind of makes sense. We're like, well, these homes were maybe going to exist for another 50, 100 years, but now it's like, is it worth it to rebuild on the coast? And so that's one thing where it's like, okay, there's homes, but then there's so many different levels to it, because, and I even heard when the fire happened, people are like, well, those are just rich people, who cares? But it's like, well, there's a lot of people that aren't rich in there. And so that kind of brings up the social justice aspect to it, where like, the people that are going to be mostly affected are the people that can't afford to rebuild or can't afford to just pick up and move. So I'm kind of bringing in weaving in two different ideas here, but I think that's kind of what I want to talk on is like the idea of the coast isn't just homes, it isn't just the beach, it isn't just uh, uh, salt marshes, it's people. And so how does social justice, how do these, I don't even know what the word is, equity, I guess, how does that fit in with how we are managing, and like, talk about to people you've talked to about how they're thinking of uh, addressing this over the next 100 years.
Well, a couple of threads I want to touch on. I mean, first, I mean, you just identified a really important tension point that I think is at the heart of so much of the reason why we're stuck on this, like, what do we do about sea level rise question, not just in California, but everywhere. And I think, first and foremost, I just want to acknowledge that there is no easy answer out of this. And there's no answer that is going to make everyone happy, and I found that in a lot of the communities I talked to, pre-disaster, post-disaster, anticipating disaster, especially in the early years of writing about this issue, everyone was just so overwhelmed, and, no choice that was presented to them came without sacrifices and controversy and like pretty scary change. And so it just felt easier to not think about it and, just to wait for a better solution to come along, or to just really focus on just what they're able to focus on, which is themselves and their own, universe of things that they felt like they had more control over. But ultimately, there is no magic solution, and finding our way forward will require a lot of compromise and creativity and a willingness to work together. And working together starts with talking about it with each other. And I think, the other thing I find myself like saying a lot, to myself and to others, is just that, one of the biggest like mind shifting moments for me when I first started reporting on sea level rise and just really getting to know the California coast, the way we've built it, the way we've come to love it, the way we've come to expect it to be for us, and what it serves, like all of the purposes and the things that we hope and dream, for the California coast. Like, so many people today still think of the coast as static, like as a place that doesn't move. I was also guilty of this when I first moved to California and fell in love with the beach. And, we think of the coast as this fixed line in the sand, and in fact, the coast, if you talk to geologists, you talk to anyone who works in the coastal space, the coast is actually a process, like a dynamic zone where land meets ocean, and it is constantly changing. It's this constant give and take between land and water. And, if you go out to any beach and look at the tide line, it is different every single time the waves come ashore. And yet you turn around and you look at Pacific Coast Highway, you look at our built infrastructure, you look at the communities we've built right on the sand, and we have tried to draw these fixed lines in the sand with our built environment. And that is at the heart of so much of the tension, like, and talking about sea level rise requires us ultimately to acknowledge that the coast itself is fundamentally supposed to move as the ocean moves inland, and we're supposed to move with it. And what does that look like? That's a scary question. And but ultimately, I think we need to acknowledge that we have, the way we've built California, the way we have settled California, we have tried to impose permanence along a space, a place that is actually supposed to be in a constant state of change. And how do we wrap our minds around that? That is kind of a big question that I think is challenged and, truly hard to talk about, especially when we have come to love these places and come to call it home. And so, to your equity question, I mean, thank you for asking that, because I think that is just like yet another critical layer to all of this, because, I've been thinking a lot like about, who we tend to who we tend to value as expert in these conversations, right? And like who's at the table and who's not at the table when we're talking about what it means to live in better reciprocity with the ocean, what it means to think about the things that we have built along our shoreline and what it is that we want to keep as we move into the future. And I think part of, writing a book and thinking about the big picture and connecting the dots is, this opportunity to recalibrate some of this expertise, right? And, it's interesting, when I tell people I'm an environmental writer, oftentimes people will be like, cool, nature, birds, writing about animals. But in reality, like writing about the environment is writing about land use policies. And our land use history is inseparable from our social history. So if you look at, our past practices of redlining and where we chose to industrialize the coast versus where we chose to invest in tourism and beautiful hotels and all, and like parks and wetlands, like all these decisions are interconnected with these social inequities that we see today. It's all interconnected with our history of who we've pushed out and also priced out from living along the coast. And so, and not to get too radical, but our settlement patterns, our settler mindset in California and, in so much of modern society today, that settler mindset of claiming permanence once you stake your claim on a place is what got us into this situation we are in today. If you really drill in on what we're fighting about and where the sticking points are with sea level rise, it is property lines and city jurisdictions. You're in charge of this and I'm in charge of this. It's about, we're trying to maintain these boundaries that have been imposed onto, again, a space that's supposed to move. And the ocean doesn't care about any of this. You build a seawall up until this point, and it's because this city is in charge of this until this point in the line of demarcation, and ocean's not going to care about the city on the other side of that seawall. And bring it all back to, like, if you look to perspectives like the indigenous perspectives that had long been overlooked in the state and often erased, from these conversations, it becomes even more clear, that how the way we've built the world as we know it today, whether it's lining the Los Angeles River with concrete or building seawalls to hold back the ocean, all of this is rooted in our kind of baked in desire to control and conquer nature. And I think there are a lot of shifts in this conversation already. And I would just say, but like, I think pointing that out might be a little blunt, but like, I think it's all important for us to recognize kind of these fundamental shifts in understanding of our relationship to the ocean, the relationship to this coastal zone, as we talk about what it means to respond to sea level rise.
There's two quotes that you or lines that you said that I really like. The coast is a process. I kind of like it's not really a place; it's a process. But then also you use the term imposing permanence on this process, and it immediately reminded me of, I used to work in Palos Verdes, and that since I've left, it's now moved a lot, really fast. And when I was there, it was still moving, and it was moving like, it was 20 feet a year or something like that. And then all of a sudden it moved a couple hundred, and then there's a new beach that formed. It was pretty wild, but it was the same kind of thing where, property boundaries were here, and that house that was in that property boundary is now 6 houses down. And so you're like, well, how do you own land if the land is constantly moving? And on top of all the ecological and cultural and indigenous stuff that was happening there. But same kind of thing was in Malibu. There are a lot of people that have owned that property for the 4 or 5 generations, and they're like, I can't just pick up and move somewhere else. Like, I can't sell my house. No one's gonna buy this. So yeah, it's it reminds me of the quote. I think it's from that 100 and something hours where the guy gets his arm stuck in the rock. I think he carved into the side of the geologic time is now, because you think it's thousands years, it's millions years. It's like, it's happening now. Like, even if it doesn't feel like it. So I didn't really have any other questions about that. I don't know. I just really, really enjoyed what you said. And I kind of, oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I kind of want to add to that, like, I think it's important to have empathy for all these perspectives because, yeah, like I talk to so many people who have had like, so many memories, generations of memories attached to a place, a home. And I don't want to invalidate that. I think that like we need to acknowledge that we have come to love not just like the coast as we've built it in the last couple of decades, but also the story we've told ourselves about this place, right? Like the California identity, for so many people is so intrinsically tied to driving a convertible down Pacific Coast Highway, right? Or, the California dream is there's so many images that are so attached to it. And none of this is wrong. And I want to acknowledge that. But I also think that it's really important to like invite people into this broader conversation of like, does it need to continue to look at like this? What does it mean to keep kind of the things that we love about the coast, but also face and address and acknowledge kind of the reality of this moving tide line? And how do we move forward into the future in a way that preserves so many of the things that we love about the coast, while also making sure that we invite people into this conversation that have been excluded from this conversation, and like recognize kind of the perspectives that have been missing in rethinking and recalibrating what our relationship to the ocean could look like. But I think all of it begins with empathy and not telling anyone they are wrong. Because I think what I realize too is that we have all been sold the story of what makes the California coast the California coast. And then, once you kind of get into it, you're like, okay, where did this begin? Where's the baseline? What came before this baseline? And I think by expanding the way we talk about the coast and our notion of the coast and our expectations for the coast, and expanding our timelines on where we start the story of California, I think is ultimately very helpful. And I found it a really good way of gently broadening this conversation in a way that doesn't get us stuck in the same loops that tend to happen when you kind of stick to the like go-to talking points on like sea level rise and climate change.
Yeah, and I love the idea of just increasing empathy in larger scale conversations and larger scale stories. Coastal, national, international. It's so easy to just kind of go like, well, shouldn't have been standing there. I don't know, And so it's really easy to just kind of go, well, that's not my problem. That sucks for them, but move on. So I really like that, and I guess kind of similar on the same line. Obviously our theme on everything we do is trying to find the positive, and how do we move forward in a positive way, or highlighting the great work that people are doing. And or for you, it's we're highlighting that the fact that you're bringing everyone together, and we're talking to all different experts and say, like, how do we take our last 100 years and make a better next 100 years? And I guess with that in mind, like, what is it that you would hope that our listeners and your readers, bigger picture, specific examples, whatever, what is it that you want them to take away from reading this book?
I mean, first and foremost, I actually found so much commonality in what people were saying to me up and down the coast in every community, even people who, were considered on opposite sides of an issue. I think we all connect with the ocean and love the ocean in our own ways. And every single person I talked to had a reason for caring and for being engaged on this issue, no matter what their position was, and whether they were in conflict with each other. And I think, in the communities where these conversations have been more productive, I've found that the planners, the local leaders, the community groups, the people who are kind of leading the charge on these conversations in these communities, they start with like questions like, what do you care about? And what do you want our community to look like 30, 40, 50 years from now? They introduce this battle against the ocean conversation more as a visioning exercise. And I think they introduce the problem as a problem that can be solved as part of an ongoing process, rather than here's a big scary report with all these big scary things and you need to vote on it now, and this one vote, and like presenting sea level rise response as like a big scary one-time action. That's where things completely explode. And I think recognizing that we don't need to have all the answers now, but we need to start taking baby steps, sometimes a little bit bigger than baby steps, towards this different future that we are all collectively working towards because we all care. We all want this place to exist in some form, decades from now. And so how do you build steps into this process in a way that no one feels like we're sacrificing everything in one go? And I think to kind of your hopeful kind of spirit of just these conversations that you're having, like yes, we're running out of time, but I think the hopeful thing is we still have time to truly make a difference, to forge a different path forward slowly but surely together. But all of that needs to start happening now. Like with sea level rise, we actually do have time to do something. But and everyone, I've talked to has known on a gut level that, the coast that we love today, the places that we call home along the shoreline, like all of that will look different somehow 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. But everyone I talked to also knew that none of these changes needed to happen today. So short-term interests and easier things tend to take over versus the like long-term planning and this ongoing process that needs to happen for sea level rise. And ultimately, like change is scary. I think, I've joked with my editor, like, oh my God, this book I thought was about sea level rise was actually a book about our capacity to change and our capacity to embrace change. And I think one of kind of the things that really crystallized for me as I got to know so many people and places and our attachment to place through the process of writing this book was just realizing that we so often frame this conversation of sea level rise adaptation of responding to climate change around what it is that we have to give up or sacrifice. But I think this issue, sea level rise, let's just focus on sea level rise adaptation, like this can be truly reframed as a conversation about what we could gain as a community if only we started this visioning process now. So, how can we present the process of adaptation as an opportunity to address like so many of the things that haven't been working for a community for a very long time? And I think when you frame it this way, the brainstorming starts to happen, the creative, imagining starts to happen. And I think, not doing anything, refusing to, think about climate change adaptation as an opportunity is basically also kind of acknowledging that the world as we know it today, like maintaining the status quo, is what we want. And I think if you talk to a lot of people up and down the coast, the status quo has not been working for a lot of communities. And to your equity point, there are just a lot of um, issues, social, political, economic, that could be attended to as part of this ongoing process of re-envisioning our shoreline.
I guess the last topic, general question we like to talk about is just like, we kind of already talked about a little bit, but optimism, hope, we call it possibilism. Michael Soule has a quote that he just says, it's all about possibilism. It's if we just really actually want to do something, it's possible, we can do it. So I guess what does that mean to you after talking to I'm sure thousands of people that you talk to for this book and everything you do at I almost called it the New York Times, LA Times, what is it that gives you that hope and makes you feel like, oh no, we're going to figure this out?
I'm laughing because I feel like I get this question all the time, and it's a question that I think about literally every single day. And this hope question, I get it in two parts. Like, how much hope do I have, and how much hope do I owe the reader? I think that's the question that haunts me every time I'm about to publish something, because this comes up a lot in the climate communication space, and whenever I talk to my colleagues, and like everyone has a different opinion on like what the right, quote unquote, right balance is between hope and urgency, and hope and despair, hope and anger. I feel like I've talked to a lot of folks recently who think that anger is a very powerful emotion to tap into when, talking about climate change. But just, I think anger to me is a very activating emotion, but I don't know how sustainable it is. And I sense and have talked to a lot of people who feel burnt out in the climate activism space. Um, I think like for me, when I publish an article, when I write a book, by the time the reader reaches the end, if I give them too much hope, I feel like that lets the reader off the hook and they can put it down and move on to another more short-term issue, more pressing issue. There's always something that you can focus your attention on. Um, that's not climate change. But if you leave the reader feeling too hopeless, or that it feels just it's too much, and the urgency is too overwhelming, people shut down. I've also seen so many people just experience kind of like this climate paralysis, and they're like, "Oh, well, the world's gonna burn, so might as well live my life," and you know, nothing I do can make a difference. And I think that's also not helpful. Um, and I feel like writing this book actually was really helpful for me in just kind of I was constantly rethinking the ending of every chapter too, and rethinking kind of the opening of every chapter and kind of where on the on ramp of hope am I bringing people into, like with every story and person and issue I'm introducing the reader to in the book. And ultimately, I realized that like hope was not the emotion that was grounding me in the process. It was the feeling of responsibility. And I realized that that was also what was the most powerful for me in my conversations with people and also in the way I was writing the book. Like, does the reader feel a sense of responsibility after reading anything that I write to do something? And that do something doesn't have to be like fix climate change. It could be literally talk to your neighbor about this issue, figure out who your environmental planner is in town, join a community garden, or just like, do one more thing to remain engaged. And that like that sense of duty to do something and to not look away takes courage. And for me, like I think courage and responsibility have been the two most grounding like feelings that I have found to be effective in my own work, both for myself and for um, the people that I'm hopefully reaching with my writing. And I think that like, how do we help more people feel brave enough to not look away? And all of that, I think, doesn't necessarily require a certain amount of hope. And I will say, like in the field, every day I am meeting people who are brave, who are, and especially in the time that we're now, like Austin, you included, like who are still in it, who are still, every day that you choose to continue to work in the space is a commitment and a practice of hope that like that all is not lost and that it's still worth the effort.
Yeah, you're speaking our language. That balance of, too much hope is make people go, oh, seems like things like it's doing all right, But really, like we kind of came to the same conclusion you have, where it's about, you know, engaging with the people doing the work every day and how do we support them, and whether that's like you said on a day-to-day basis, or donating if you can, or whatever you can figure out. And that's kind of why we're doing this. And that kind of leads to my next question is like, how do you kind of already said it, but how do you what's your advice on how people can get involved? Like, do you have organizations that you really love what they do that you would like to endorse? If you don't, that's fine. You might, but is there anything specific that, especially maybe in Southern California, where you're more engaged here, but how do people get involved?
Yeah, I attribute this to Bill McKibben, but I think a lot of folks have said this, but I remember him saying this years ago when I was in a room, younger, greener environmental reporter, hearing someone else ask Bill McKibben this question. And he was like, join something bigger than yourself. And I really love that. And so, whatever that bigger something is, be a part of a movement. And I think, you know, being on the road with this book, I feel like I've met a lot of other really incredible environmental writers. And in the last few months, I feel like I was just talking to Ferris Jaber, who wrote Becoming Earth, which is a fantastic book. And Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson has been saying this a lot too. But like the Japanese concept of ikigai has, like, I feel like I've heard this in a few spaces. Ferris and I were just talking about it, and Ayanna has brought this up a lot. But just, it's like if you think about the Venn diagram of like what you're good at, what the world needs and what brings you joy, like whatever is in that middle of those three things, do it. And I think that like this concept of ikigai applied to climate change work and climate change action could be really effective. And I think, I've loved what Ayana has said about just needing to remember the joy in like doing this, because joy will prevent the burnout, right? And I think the ultimately there is a lot of love and inspiration and joy and community in doing work in the climate space, whatever it is that you choose to do and whatever it is that you're good at doing, and whatever your skills are that you can volunteer and bring to the table for all of the many, many actions that need to be taken to kind of steer our society onto a different, more sustainable path. And I think what you were saying earlier too, I think something that I've been thinking a lot about is just the difference between what climate action looks like and what climate commitment looks like. And it's such a subtle shift in phrasing, but like, what does waking up every day committed to staying engaged look like versus going to one protest or doing one big action a year? And I think that like all of those things are important. If what you have in you is to take one big action or to participate every once in a while, that's great. That's still so much more than what was being done before. But I think kind of encouraging people to think about what commitment to the issue looks like and what a day-to-day practice of hope, of empathy, of just taking one more step every single day towards helping one more person shift the way they think about this issue. Like those are all small ripples that could add to such a bigger whole. And I think that, again, like it feels overwhelming to start, but I think once you start small and you join something much bigger than yourself, it opens the world to you in terms of what is possible.
Well, great, Rosanna. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been I've had a great time talking to you about the California coastline, something I'm very passionate about. So, can you just tell the people where they can find you? One thing we didn't mention is you also have a documentary along with the book California Against the Sea. So please just let everyone know where we can find everything you've done and where they can see you because you're on book tour. So where can we find you?
Thank you, Austin. Yes, I am on kind of the film festival circuit right now for our documentary Out of Plain Sight, which is based on another pretty mind-boggling investigation that I did a couple years ago, just looking at the history of all the chemicals that we have dumped into the ocean. And I'm laughing at this question because the number of people have told me, you need to create a website so that we know how to find you. And it's been on my to-do list under the 5,000 emails I need to respond to. So one day there will be a website. I'm mostly on Instagram these days. I don't really know how to navigate Twitter and X. And I've also promised, a number of folks that I would join Blue Sky, but I'm also overwhelmed by the thought of creating another social media app on my phone. So, for now, yeah, like come say hi. I love the in-person events. I will be traveling quite a bit. I'm still doing talks for the book. I'm really grateful for everyone's continued interest in the book. And I think, yeah, there's been something really magical too, being in movie theaters with people experiencing a story together for 2 hours. And yeah, come find me in person. I'd love to say hello.
We want to say thank you again to Rosanna for taking the time to talk with us. So please go find her book, her documentary Out of Plain Sight, and all of her work with the LA Times. She's published so many great stories. You can find her on social media at rosanna.xia and her website at rosannaxia.com and help support her in getting these kinds of stories out to the world. Host and producer is Austin Parker. Music was provided by A Picture Book Studios. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you want to help. Thanks again. We'll talk to you next time.